The Wyoming wind, sharp as a skinning knife, snatched at Eliza Miller's thin shawl as she stood before the weathered gate of the Broken Wheel Ranch. Dust devils spun across the vast, ochre emptiness, mirroring the whirlwind of fear in her chest. Inside the worn leather pouch, clutched in her trembling hand, lay her mother's recipes, ink smudged by fevered fingers and the crushing weight of desperation. Across the yard, framed by the sagging porch of the ranch house, stood Silas Morgan. His silhouette was stark against the bleached morning sky, a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape, his gaze as remote and assessing as the distant bighorns. One chance, that's all she'd begged for. One chance to keep the medicine coming. The roof over their heads, while her mother's breath rattled like dry seeds in a gourd back in their cramped soddy. His silence stretched longer than the horizon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. Eliza forced her chin up, meeting Silas Morgan's eyes across the expanse of hard-packed earth. The wind whipped strands of dark hair free from her braid, stinging her cheeks. She saw no welcome there, only a weary skepticism etched deep into the lines around his eyes, grooves worn by sun and solitude. He hadn't spoken since her hesitant knock, just jerked his head towards the low, lean-to structure tacked onto the side of the main house, the Cookshack, her mother's domain, until the coughing started. The walk across the yard felt endless. Every step crunched on gravel and grit, loud in the vast silence broken only by the mournful lowing of cattle from distant pastures and the rhythmic clang of a hammer from the blacksmith's shed. The air smelled of dust, sun-baked pine, horsehide, and something deeper, earthier, manure and dry grass. She pushed open the Cookshack door, its hinges groaning a rusty protest. Inside, the air was thick and still, smelling of stale wood smoke, old grease, and the ghost of yesterday's coffee. Weak light filtered through a single grimy window, illuminating a scene of functional chaos. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, cold and imposing. Rough-hewn shelves held dented tins and jars, their contents cryptic shadows. A scarred wooden table, large enough to seat a dozen hungry men, occupied the center, littered with crumbs and sticky rings. Pots hung haphazardly from nails, and a pile of unwashed dishes sat soaking in a chipped enamel basin. It felt abandoned, yet saturated with a lingering presence of her mother's bustling energy, now conspicuously absent. A wave of profound loneliness washed over Eliza, sharper than the wind outside. This wasn't just a job. It was stepping into the warm space her mother had filled, a space now cold and daunting. She took a shaky breath, setting her worn leather pouch carefully on the cleanest corner of the table. Mama needs this. The thought was a mantra, a lifeline. She shrugged off her shawl, hanging it on a peg by the door, revealing a simple, faded calico dress, patched neatly at the elbow. Rolling up her sleeves, she began. First order. She attacked the dirty dishes, pumping icy water at the sink outside the back door, her knuckles turning red. The metallic squeal of the pump handle echoed in the yard. Back inside, scrubbing with coarse lye soap, she methodically cleared the basin, stacking the clean plates with a quiet clatter. She swept the packed dirt floor, raising little clouds of dust motes that danced in the sunbeam. She wiped down the table, the rough wood grain catching on her calloused fingertips. She organized the shelves, aligning jars of beans, flour, sugar, salt, and precious coffee. Each task was small, a reclaiming of the space, a quiet assertion of her presence. Only when the Cookshack breathed a little easier, when the lingering chaos was pushed back into corners, did she approach the stove. It was a behemoth, cold iron radiating a palpable chill. She remembered her mother's instructions. Check the flue first, girl. A cold stove's like a sulking bear, needs careful waking up. She opened the firebox, finding a bed of gray ash. Kneeling, she scraped it out into a metal bucket, the grit coating her hands. She laid kindling, dry pine shavings and small, splintered sticks salvaged from the wood box, with the care of building a tiny, vital city. Striking a match, the sharp sulfur smell cut through the dusty air. A small, bright flame caught, licking hungrily at the tinder. She fed it carefully, adding larger splits of seasoned pine, listening to the satisfying crackle and pop as warmth began to seep into the heavy iron. The fire established, she turned to the pantry. Supplies were meager but functional. Sacks of beans and flour, a slab of salt pork wrapped in muslin, a few withered potatoes starting to sprout eyes, onions hanging in a net bag, a precious half jar of molasses. Her mother's faint, looping handwriting on the recipe card in her pouch suggested simple fare for the midday meal. Beans simmered with salt pork and onion, biscuits, strong coffee. It was a test, she knew. Filling, cheap, and deceptively difficult to make satisfying for men who worked from dawn till dusk breaking their backs against the stubborn land. Eliza measured dried beans into a pot, picked through them for stones, then covered them with water from the pump, the icy shock numbing her fingers again. She set the pot near the growing heat of the stove to soak. Next, the biscuits. Flour puffed into the air as she sifted it into a large bowl, adding a pinch of precious salt and a dollop of rendered lard kept cool in a crock. She worked the lard in with her fingertips, the mixture turning crumbly and cool. Using water sparingly, she mixed it just until it came together, then turned the dough out onto the floured table. Her movements were economical, learned through years of helping her mother, not just in this shack, but in their own meager kitchen. She kneaded it briefly, just enough to smooth it, then rolled it out with a heavy, scarred rolling pin that felt familiar in her grip. Cutting rounds with an upturned tin cup, she placed them on a battered sheet pan. Simple, essential. The salt pork needed rendering. She chopped the tough, pink and white slab into small cubes, the cleaver thudding dully on the wooden block. Into a heavy skillet they went, sizzling immediately as they hit the heat. The smell was rich, fatty, primal, the smell of hard work and survival. She stirred the cubes patiently, watching them shrink and crisp, releasing their precious fat. When they were golden brown nuggets, she scooped them out, leaving the liquid gold in the pan. Chopped onion followed, sizzling and softening in the pork fat, filling the shack with a sweet, pungent aroma that made her own empty stomach clench. She drained the beans, added them to the skillet with the onions, poured in fresh water, and nestled the skillet onto a cooler part of the stove to begin their long, slow simmer. The rhythmic plop-plop of the beans, starting to bubble, was the first sound of cooking life she'd brought to the shack. She was scrubbing the flour dust from the table when the door creaked open. Silas Morgan stood there, framed by the daylight. He didn't enter, just filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking much of the light. His gaze swept the room, the swept floor, the organized shelves, the clean dishes, the pot of soaking beans now simmering, the biscuits waiting on the pan, the fire glowing steadily in the stove. His expression was unreadable, a mask carved from weathered oak. He said nothing. His eyes lingered for a moment on her hands, red from scrubbing and the cold water, then flicked to her face. Eliza stood very still, the damp cloth clutched in her fist. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the gentle sigh of the beans. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. Dinner bells at noon sharp. Hands got 30 minutes. He paused, his gaze resting on the biscuit dough. Don't burn him. Then he turned and was gone, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud, leaving Eliza alone with the smell of onions and pork fat and the thunderous pounding of her own heart. It wasn't approval. It wasn't even acceptance. But it wasn't refusal. It was a reprieve, measured in beans and biscuits. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and turned back to the stove, sliding the pan of biscuits onto the hotter section. The real test was coming. The morning bled away in a haze of heat and concentration. She kept the fire banked just right, fed the beans more water as they swelled and softened, stirred them to prevent sticking. She slid the biscuits into the oven, their tops pale and promising. The smell began to change, deepening, becoming richer, the earthy beans melding with the savory pork and sweet onions. She made coffee, strong and black, the bitter aroma cutting through the other scents. As noon approached, the tension coiled tighter within her. She heard the distant sounds of the ranch hands finishing their morning tasks. The jingle of harnesses, gruff shouts, the thud of hooves as horses were led to the corral. Her mother's old tin, triangle hung by the door, ready to be struck. At precisely 5 minutes of noon, she took a deep breath, picked up the heavy metal striker, and stepped outside. The sudden brightness made her blink. Raising the striker, she hit the triangle. A clear, sharp clang shattered the midday stillness, echoing across the yard, bouncing off the barn walls, carrying out towards the pastures. It was a sound that called men to sustenance, a sound her mother had made countless times. The effect was immediate. Figures detached themselves from the barn, the corral, the blacksmith shed, moving with the weary purpose of men drawn by the promise of hot food. She retreated into the cookshack, the sudden responsibility pressing down on her. She pulled the biscuits from the oven, golden brown, thank goodness. She ladled the thick, bubbling beans into a large, deep serving bowl, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. She filled a pitcher with coffee. Setting it all on the now clean table felt like preparing an offering to stern gods. The hands filed in a wave of sweat, leather, and dust. Big men, faces weathered by wind and work, hands rough and scarred. They nodded mutely at her, their eyes curious, some openly skeptical, others merely weary. They took their accustomed places on the long benches, the wood groaning under their weight. Silas Morgan entered last. He didn't sit immediately, but stood near the head of the table, his gaze sweeping over the food, then settling on Eliza, who stood nervously near the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. No one spoke. The only sound was the scrape of benches and the clink of a tin cup being set down. The silence was thick, expectant. Silas reached for the bowl of beans. He spooned a generous helping onto his plate. He took 2 biscuits. He didn't look at her again. He simply picked up his fork. Eliza held her breath. This was the moment. Her mother's job, their survival, her one chance. All distilled into the simple act of this lonely, hardened man lifting a forkful of beans to his mouth. She watched his face, searching for any flicker, disgust, disappointment, indifference. He chewed slowly, deliberately. His expression remained impassive, unreadable. He took a bite of biscuit, chewing that with the same measured pace. He reached for his coffee cup, took a long sip. Then, without a word, without a glance in her direction, Silas Morgan simply kept eating. He took another forkful of beans, another bite of biscuit. He didn't praise it. He didn't complain. He just ate, steadily, purposefully, cleaning his plate with the focus of a man who valued fuel over flavor. Around him, the other hands followed suit, the clatter of forks and the low murmur of conversation gradually filling the room as the initial tension eased. Relief, warm and shaky, flooded through Eliza. He was eating it. It was acceptable. She busied herself refilling coffee cups, her hands trembling only slightly. She avoided Silas's end of the table, focusing on the other men who offered gruff thanks or nods. She cleared empty plates, the weight on her shoulders lessening with each one. She'd done it. She'd passed the first, terrifying hurdle. As the meal wound down and the hands began to shuffle out, returning to their labors, Eliza started the monumental task of washing up. The shack was quieter now, filled with the warm, greasy smell of the meal and the rhythmic splash of dishwater. She was elbow deep in the basin, scrubbing a stubborn spot of bean residue from a plate, when she heard the door open again. Expecting another hand needing coffee, she turned. It was Silas. He stood just inside the doorway, silhouetted once more. He wasn't leaving. He was watching her. His plate had been spotless, but his expression now held something different from the morning's skepticism or the noontime assessment. It was a look of intense, almost painful scrutiny, as if he were trying to see past her skin, past the calico dress and the worn apron. His gaze wasn't on the clean shack or the stacked dishes. It was fixed on her face, on the faint sheen of sweat at her temples, on the determined set of her jaw as she scrubbed. He took a single step further into the room. The air felt charged, thick with unspoken words. Eliza froze, the plate forgotten in her soapy hands, water dripping onto the floor. What did he see? Did he see the girl barely out of childhood, trembling inside? Did he see the ghost of her mother in her movements? Or did he see something else entirely? Silas opened his mouth, closed it again, a muscle working in his jaw. His eyes, usually as hard and gray as flint, seemed to hold a flicker of something raw, something old and deeply buried. Not anger, not dismissal, something closer to recognition, or profound, unsettling pain. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, and Eliza felt utterly exposed, as if he could see the fear, the exhaustion, the desperate hope she tried so hard to conceal. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, a solitary figure radiating a loneliness so profound it seemed to echo in the suddenly silent Cookshack. His gaze stripping her bare, leaving her wondering what shadow from his own past she had unwittingly summoned. Then, abruptly, he turned on his heel and walked out, the door clicking shut softly behind him, leaving Eliza alone with the cooling dishwater, the echoing silence, and the chilling uncertainty of what that look had meant. The reprieve, it seemed, was far more fragile than she dared to hope. The echo of the door clicking shut behind Silas Morgan lingered in the Cookshack like the final note of a discordant chord. Eliza stood frozen, the plate heavy and slippery in her soapy hands, water dripping steadily onto the newly swept floor. That look, raw, searching, filled with a loneliness so deep it felt like a physical chill, had stripped her bare. It wasn't about the beans or the biscuits. It was about something else entirely, something tethered to the shadows in the corners of this room, or perhaps the shadows behind Silas's flint-gray eyes. Forcing a breath, Eliza plunged her hands back into the cooling, greasy water. Focus on the task. One plate, one pot, one day at a time. The rhythmic scrubbing became a mantra, pushing back the unease Silas had left behind. The hands had eaten. Silas had eaten. That was the victory, however small and silent. Her mother's job, for now, was still hers. The coins Silas paid weekly were the only barrier between her mother and the grim finality the town doctor had hinted at with a weary shake of his head. Dawns at the broken wheel became a ritual etched in chill and quiet purpose. Eliza arrived before the first hint of pink touched the eastern sky, the Wyoming air crisp enough to bite, smelling of sage, cold earth, and the distant tang of cattle. Inside the Cookshack, the silence felt different now, less abandoned, more expectant. She'd made it her own, in small ways. A jar of dried wildflowers, gathered on her walk and startlingly purple against the rough wood, sat on the windowsill. A clean, albeit patched, flour sack towel hung neatly by the sink. Order was her shield against chaos, both outside and the fluttering fear within. The ranch hands, a taciturn bunch led by the grizzled foreman, Hank, treated her with a cautious neutrality that slowly warmed to a grudging respect. Empty plates were her first accolades. Requests for seconds, muttered over tin mugs of coffee, were small triumphs. Hank, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by wind and sun, even offered a rare, gravelly mornin', Miss Eliza, as he collected his breakfast biscuit wrapped in cloth for the range. Her cooking settled into a rhythm mirroring the ranch's demands. Hearty stews simmered for hours, filling the shack with rich, meaty aromas. Cornbread emerged golden and crumbly from the oven's heat. She learned the sourdough starter her mother had nurtured, a living thing bubbling quietly in its crock on the cool pantry shelf, was the ranch's secret weapon. Old Bessie, her mother had called it, passed down from the ranch's first cook. Eliza fed it faithfully, flour and water, watching the bubbles rise and fall like a slow, yeasty breath. The tangy, complex sourdough biscuits became her signature, requested by name. One blustery morning, wrestling a sack of flour from the pantry, Eliza heard a sharp crack followed by a frustrated grunt from the yard. Peering out the window, she saw Silas by the corral fence. A heavy post had split near the top where he'd been hammering a new rail. He stood staring at the splintered wood, shoulders slumped, a picture of weary frustration against the vast, indifferent sky. Without conscious thought, Eliza wiped her hands, grabbed a roll of sturdy twine and a hammer from the Cookshack's meager tool stash. Tools her mother had kept for just such minor repairs. She approached cautiously, the wind whipping her apron around her legs. Silas didn't turn, but his posture stiffened slightly, aware of her presence. She stopped a few feet away, holding out the hammer and twine. "Might bind it temporary, Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind, sighing through the sagebrush. "Till a new post can be cured." He turned slowly. His gaze flickered from the tools in her hands to her face, then back to the broken post. A long moment passed, filled only by the wind and the distant bawl of a calf. Then a curt nod. "Not thanks." Acknowledgement. He took the hammer from her, his calloused fingers brushing hers briefly, a touch as impersonal as handling a tool, yet it sent a jolt through her. He worked quickly, expertly binding the splintered wood with tight loops of twine, his movements economical and strong. Eliza stood silently, watching, the smell of damp earth and pine resin strong in the air. When he finished, he handed the hammer back. His eyes met hers again. That same intense scrutiny was there, but beneath it, perhaps a flicker of something else. Curiosity? Assessment of a different kind? He gave another slight nod, almost imperceptible, then turned back to his task, dismissing her. The small exchange echoed in her mind as she returned to the Cookshack. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't the chilling isolation of before. It was a transaction, a need met, a boundary respected. She began noticing more. The way Silas always ate alone at the far end of the table, even when the hands lingered over coffee. How he moved through the ranch with a solitary efficiency, speaking only when necessary. And the ranch house itself. Through the Cookshack's connecting door, which always stood slightly ajar for heat, she caught glimpses. Stark, functional, devoid of the small comforts she associated with home. No curtains, no pictures, no clutter. Just a table, chairs, a cold hearth, and a door at the back she assumed led to his private quarters. One afternoon, while fetching water, she saw him standing rigidly in the ranch house doorway, staring out at the distant hills, his hand resting on the doorframe. The late afternoon sun caught the lines on his face, deepening them into ravines of sorrow. He stood so still, so utterly alone, that Eliza felt like an intruder just witnessing it. She retreated quietly, her heart hammering. The complication arrived not with a shout, but with the weather. The sky, usually a vast, unbroken blue, began to haze over a few days later. The air grew heavy, oppressive, the wind dying to an unnerving stillness. By midday, towering thunderheads, bruised purple and slate gray, muscled their way over the bighorns, swallowing the peaks. The smell changed, dust giving way to the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and damp earth. A storm was coming, the kind that could turn dry washes into torrents and spook cattle into stampedes. Eliza worked faster, securing the Cookshack. She latched the shutters over the grimy window. She checked the woodpile under the lean-to, bringing in an extra armful. She filled every available pot and bucket with water from the pump, the icy liquid numbing her fingers anew. The sourdough biscuits for supper were already rising under a cloth. She hoped the changing pressure wouldn't ruin them. As she banked the fire for the slow-cooking stew, the first low growl of thunder rolled across the land, vibrating in the floorboards beneath her feet. The hands came in early for supper, their faces grim, talking in low tones about securing stock, checking fences. The usual quiet murmur was replaced by a tense buzz. Silas entered last, bringing the smell of the storm with him, wet leather and charged air. He took his seat without a word, his movements tight with suppressed energy. The meal was eaten quickly, efficiently. The men focused on the impending battle with the elements rather than the food, though Eliza noted the stew pot was scraped clean and the biscuits vanished. As the last hands hurried out into the gathering gloom, the first fat raindrops began to splatter against the roof, a hesitant drumbeat quickly building in intensity. Eliza started clearing the table, the clatter of plates loud against the roar of the rain, now lashing the Cookshack. Wind whistled through the cracks around the door, making the lamp flame gutter. Silas hadn't moved. He sat at the end of the long table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling before him, staring not at the storm, but the last sourdough biscuit remaining on the serving plate. His profile was stark in the flickering lamplight, etched with a weariness that seemed bone-deep. Eliza hesitated, plate in hand. The storm's fury outside mirrored the tension coiling within the small shack. She moved to clear his place, steeling herself for his usual silent departure. As she reached for his plate, his hand moved, not towards the plate, but towards the biscuit. He picked it up, his large, work-roughened fingers surprisingly gentle on the brown crust. He didn't need it. He just held it, turning it slowly, studying it as if it held some hidden meaning. Eliza froze, caught in the intimacy of the moment, the howl of the wind underscoring the silence between them. Then Silas spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, almost lost beneath the drumming rain on the roof, but it cut through the noise to her core. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the biscuit in his hand. "My wife," he said, the words emerging slowly, heavily, like stones pulled from deep mud. She used to make biscuits like this. He paused, the silence stretching taut, filled only by the storm's rage. Sourdough, tangy. Another pause, longer this time. His thumb brushed a crumb from the crust. They were her favorite too. He fell silent. The admission hung in the air, fragile and immense, as vulnerable as a bird caught in the downpour. He had spoken of a wife. Past tense. Used to. Were. The words settled over Eliza, cold and heavy. The biscuit wasn't just food. It was a key, turning in a lock she hadn't known existed, opening a door onto a vast, unspoken ocean of loss that explained the loneliness etched into every line of him, the avoidance of the house, the solitary meals. Before Eliza could process it, before she could find breath or words, Silas abruptly stood up. The chair scraped harshly on the floor. He placed the biscuit back on the plate with deliberate care, as if it were made of glass. His face, when he finally looked at her, wasn't raw as it had been that first day, but shuttered, closed off, the brief vulnerability sealed away as quickly as it had appeared. There was something else there now, too, a flicker of alarm, almost fear, at having revealed even that much. He looked towards the door, where the storm raged in full fury, wind howling like a banshee, rain sheeting down. "Check the roof beam over the pantry," he said, his voice back to its usual rough command, but strained. "When it rains hard, there's a drip." He didn't wait for a response. Turning on his heel, he strode out into the deluge, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that shook the walls, leaving Eliza alone with the echoing thunder, the relentless drumming rain. the cooling biscuit on the plate, and the staggering, heartbreaking weight of his 6 simple words. The storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest of grief and secrecy she now knew resided in the heart of Silas Morgan. A tempest she had unwittingly stirred with nothing more than flour, water, and the ghost of a woman named only his wife. The storm raged through the night, a relentless percussion on the Cookshack roof that matched the tumult in Eliza's mind. Silas's words, "My wife, she used to make biscuits like this," echoed louder than the thunder. They weren't just an explanation. They were a stark map of the desolation within the man who owned the broken wheel. She pictured him out there, swallowed by the downpour, fleeing not the weather, but the ghost he'd accidentally summoned with a simple biscuit. The vulnerability he'd shown, then instantly recoiled from, left her feeling both humbled and strangely responsible. She'd stirred the ashes of a grief she hadn't known existed. Dawn broke bruised and dripping. The world outside was transformed, mud sucking at boots, puddles reflecting the wash-clean sky, the air thick with the petrichor of wet sage and damp earth. Inside the Cookshack, the leak Silas had warned about materialized, a persistent, rhythmic plink-plink from the beam over the pantry corner, landing in the bucket she'd wisely placed there. The sound was a quiet reminder of his fleeting confession. Eliza moved through her routine with a newfound awareness. Feeding old Bessie, the sourdough starter, felt like tending a fragile inheritance. She handled the crock with extra care, the tangy smell now imbued with the weight of memory. When Hank, the foreman, stomped in for his early coffee, his usual grunt held a note of concern. "Fence down south pasture. Morgan's out with the boys already. Nasty mess." He gulped the hot liquid, his eyes scanning the shack. "Roof hold it?" His gaze lingered on the dripping bucket. "Mostly," Eliza replied, pouring more coffee into his outstretched cup. "Just the one spot Mr. Morgan mentioned." She saw Hank's bushy eyebrows twitch slightly at the use of Mr. Morgan. Respect was settling layer by layer like dust. The day demanded fortification. Eliza decided on thick cornmeal mush with molasses for breakfast, and for the hands heading out to the damaged fence, she packed hefty sourdough sandwiches layered with leftover stew meat and sharp cheese, wrapped in clean cloth. As she worked, her gaze kept drifting to the connecting door to the ranch house, slightly ajar as always. It felt different now, charged with the silent history Silas had acknowledged. Later, mending a tear in one of the hand's shirts, a skill honed patching her own and her mother's worn things, she noticed movement outside. Silas was back early, alone, leading his mud-spattered bay, gelding towards the barn. He moved with the same weary efficiency, but his shoulders seemed bowed by more than physical fatigue. He disappeared into the barn's dim interior. An hour later, as Eliza was kneading dough for the evening's bread, a different sound intruded on the rhythmic plink of the leak. A measured tap-tap-tap came from the Cookshack roof, directly above the pantry. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the watery sunlight. Silas was on the roof, a small hammer in hand, a bundle of cedar shingles beside him. He wasn't looking at her. His focus was entirely on the offending spot. He worked methodically, prying up a damaged shingle, fitting a new one, nailing it down with sharp, precise blows. The sound echoed across the quiet yard, a practical, unspoken response to the vulnerability of the night before. He was mending the leak, perhaps trying to mend the breach he'd made in his own carefully constructed solitude. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her presence below. When he finished, he gathered his tools and shingles, climbed down the ladder with the agility of a much younger man, and walked back towards the barn without a glance or way. The gesture, small and silent, spoke volumes. It wasn't thanks, nor was it an apology. It was an act of preservation for the Cookshack, perhaps for the fragile, unspoken truce between them. The repaired roof felt like a subtle shift. Eliza found herself looking for other small things to mend, not just in the shack, but in the fabric of the ranch life she was weaving. She patched a tear in the flour sack curtain. She organized the mismatched collection of tin cups by the wash basin. One afternoon, noticing Silas rubbing his shoulder with a grimace after wrestling a heavy feed sack, she quietly brewed a strong pot of willow bark tea her mother used for aches, leaving it on the stove with a clean cup nearby. He didn't drink it while she was there, but later, when she returned from dumping scraps for the chickens, the cup was empty, washed, and placed neatly on the drain board. Respect from the hands solidified into a comfortable rhythm. Jed, the youngest hand, shyly asked if she could teach him to make biscuits half as good as yours, Miss Miller. She showed him the care needed with Old Bessie, the feel of the dough. The shared task, flour dusting their arms, felt like belonging. Even Hank gruffly mentioned the sandwiches had hit the spot right proper after the muddy fence repair. Eliza's own thoughts, however, increasingly turned eastward towards the small soddy and the frail woman fighting for breath within it. Every coin Silas paid her on Friday afternoons was carefully wrapped and tucked away, destined for the doctor and the apothecary in town. The distance felt vast, the worry a constant, gnawing companion beneath the surface of her daily tasks. She'd sent word with a passing freighter the week before, but no reply had come. The complication arrived not with a clap of thunder, but with the creak of saddle leather and the weary plod of a horse. It was mid-afternoon, the sun warm on the drying earth, when Tom Burgess, who ran the small way station 10 miles east, rode into the yard. Dust coated him and his horse, and his expression was grave as he dismounted near the Cookshack where Eliza was shelling peas on the back step. "Miss Miller," he called, removing his hat. "Got a letter here. For you. Came through on the stage to my place yesterday. Looked important." He held out a slightly grubby envelope. Eliza's heart stuttered. Important letters rarely brought good news out here. Her name was written in a spidery hand she didn't recognize, not her mother's. She wiped her hands hastily on her apron and took it, the paper feeling unnaturally heavy. "Thank you, Mr. Burgess," she managed, her voice tight. "Can I get you some water? Coffee? Oblige, ma'am, but I'd best be heading back. Just wanted to get that to you prompt-like." He tipped his hat again and remounted, leaving Eliza alone in the sudden silence, the envelope burning in her hand. She retreated into the relative privacy of the Cookshack. The rhythmic plink from the now-dry pantry corner was gone, thanks to Silas's repairs, but the silence felt just as loud. She stared at the unfamiliar handwriting. It could be from the doctor, or the neighbor who sometimes checked on her mother. Her fingers trembled as she broke the brittle seal. Before she could unfold the single sheet inside, the Cookshack door opened. Silas stood there, holding a small, worn leather-bound book. He'd clearly been heading towards her, perhaps to leave it on the table. Maybe a ledger, maybe something else entirely. His eyes immediately went to the letter in her shaking hands, then lifted to her face, reading the fear she couldn't conceal. He stopped just inside the doorway. The air thickened. He didn't ask. He simply stood, observing her distress, the book momentarily forgotten in his grip. His usual guarded expression softened minutely, a flicker of something akin to concern momentarily displacing the habitual remoteness. It was the look he might give a skittish cold. Eliza's gaze darted from the letter to Silas, then back. The words on the page swam before her eyes. She only managed to read the first few lines, scrawled in haste. "Eliza, come quick if you can. Your ma took a bad turn 2 nights ago. Fever's high, cough's worse. Doctor bled her, but the rest blurred. A cold dread, colder than the Wyoming wind, seeped into her bones. Bad turn. Fever high, if you can." The unspoken before it's too late hung in the air, more terrifying than any storm. Her job, the ranch, Silas's fragile trust, the precious coins saved for medicine. It all crumbled before the stark terror of losing her mother. She looked up at Silas, her eyes wide with panic, the letter crumpling slightly in her fist. He saw it, the raw, desperate fear of a child facing the abyss. He took a half step forward, the worn leather book still in his hand, forgotten. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, perhaps to ask, perhaps to offer something. But what could he offer? Time? A miracle? The silence stretched, brittle and charged. Eliza stood paralyzed, the devastating words echoing in her mind, the weight of her world collapsing onto her thin shoulders. Silas remained frozen in the doorway, the unspoken question hanging between them, his own carefully guarded expression now mirroring a fraction of her helplessness. The carefully built rhythm of the ranch, the tentative understanding between cook and rancher, shattered in the face of this stark, personal tragedy unfolding in a single, crumpled page. Eliza needed to leave. Now. But how? And what would Silas Morgan, a man who built walls against loss, say to a girl standing on the precipice of her own? The unopened book in his hand felt like a symbol of everything left unsaid, everything that couldn't possibly matter in this terrible, suspended moment. The letter lay crumpled on the Cookshack table, its spidery words a silent scream in Eliza's mind. Come quick if you can. Fever's high. The air in the shack felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and cooling coffee, despite the sun climbing outside, drying the storm-soaked earth. Silas's silhouette lingered in her memory, his half-step forward, the worn leather book in his hand, the unspoken concern in his eyes. He hadn't spoken, hadn't offered comfort, but his presence had been a tether in that moment of panic. Now, alone with the weight of her mother's illness, Eliza felt the ranch's fragile rhythm slipping through her fingers like dry Wyoming sand. She forced herself to move. The Cookshack demanded it. The hands would expect supper, simple, hearty fare to fuel their endless work. She grabbed a sack of dried apples from the pantry, the rough burlap scratching her palms, and began peeling them for a cobbler. The knife moved mechanically, each slice a small rebellion against the dread knotting her chest. She couldn't think about the letter, not yet. She needed to cook, to keep the fire alive, to hold this place together until she could decide, stay or go. The coins in her apron pocket, earned from weeks of sweat and flour dust, were not enough. Not yet. Not for a doctor, not for medicine, not for the hope her mother needed. The day unfolded in a haze of routine. She stirred a pot of venison stew, the rich, gamey aroma mingling with the sweet tang of apples baking in the oven. She fed old Bessie, the sourdough starter, her hands trembling as she mixed flour and water into the bubbling crock. The shack was her sanctuary, its order a bulwark against chaos, but today it felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the shutters, reminded her of the miles between the ranch and her mother's soddy. She glanced at the letter, still unfolded on the table, and quickly looked away. Outside, the ranch was a hive of post-storm recovery. The hands, led by Hank, were repairing the south pasture fence, their distant shouts carrying on the breeze. Horses snorted in the corral, their hooves churning the mud into a thick paste. Eliza stepped out to fetch water, the pump handle squealing under her grip. The air smelled of wet sagebrush and fresh-turned earth, the sky a piercing blue streaked with lingering clouds. As she hauled the bucket back, she saw Silas by the barn, his hat tilted low, inspecting a limping mare. His hands moved gently over the animal's leg, his face set in concentration. He didn't look her way, but she felt the weight of his presence, as if the Cookshack and barn were tethered by an invisible thread. Back inside, she noticed the leather-bound book Silas had held the day before. It sat on the edge of the table, near the letter, as if he'd left it there deliberately. It was small, its cover cracked and faded, the edges worn smooth by years of handling. She hesitated, then touched it lightly, her fingers tracing a faint embossed pattern, a single wildflower barely discernible. It felt personal, a relic of a life before the ranch's stark solitude. She pulled her hand back, guilt prickling her skin. It wasn't hers to touch, not yet. The hands filed in for supper, their boots tracking mud across her clean floor. They ate with their usual quiet efficiency, spoons scraping bowls, murmurs of appreciation breaking the silence. "Good stew, Miss Miller," Jed said shyly, his young face flushed from the day's labor. Hank nodded, his weathered hand reaching for another slice of cornbread. Eliza managed a small smile, refilling coffee cups, but her eyes kept drifting to the empty chair at the table's head. Silas hadn't come. He rarely ate with the hands, but tonight his absence felt heavier, like a storm cloud waiting to break. As she cleared the table, the door creaked open. Silas stood there, his hat in hand, his coat dusted with barn dirt. His eyes flicked to the book, then to her, then away. He stepped inside, setting a small, chipped tin on the counter. A rusted container, no bigger than a biscuit, with a faint floral pattern etched into the lid. "Found it in the barn," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "Thought you might use it. For spices or such." He didn't meet her gaze, his fingers lingering on the tin before retreating. Eliza's breath caught. It was a small thing, practical, but the act felt like an offering, a bridge across the chasm of yesterday's silence. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded once, then turned to leave, but paused at the door. "That mare," he said, his back to her. "She's lambing up bad. Might not make it." His words were clipped, but there was a tremor beneath them, a confession of another kind of loss. He stepped out into the dusk, the door clicking shut behind him. The tin sat on the counter, its presence as weighty as the letter. Eliza opened it, finding it empty but clean, the faint scent of old tobacco lingering inside. She placed a pinch of dried sage inside, the sharp, earthy aroma grounding her. It was a gesture like the repaired roof, like the empty teacup, small, silent, but deliberate. Silas was reaching out in his guarded way, and it stirred something in her, a warmth that battled the cold dread of the letter. The new development came at dusk, as the sky turned a bruised purple. Hank burst into the Cookshack, his face grim, his hat dripping from a sudden squall. "Miss Miller," he said, breathless. "It's the mare. She's down in the barn, and Morgan's with her, but there's trouble. One of the hands, Cal, he's stirring up a fuss. Says we can't afford to lose another animal. Not after the storm. Blaming Morgan for not calling the vet sooner. Might come to blows." His eyes darted to the door, urgency in his voice. "You're steady with him. Might need you there." Eliza's heart thudded. Cal, a burly hand with a temper, had been quiet but surly at meals, his skepticism of her cooking barely concealed. Now, his frustration was spilling over, and Silas was the target. She grabbed her shawl, the letter, and tin forgotten, and followed Hank into the gathering dark. The barn loomed ahead, its doors ajar, lantern light spilling out in a golden wedge. The air was thick with the smell of wet hay and nervous horses, the mare's pained whinnies cutting through the patter of rain. Inside, Silas knelt beside the mare, his hands steady as he wrapped her leg with a cloth. Cal stood over him, his voice sharp. "Should have sent for Doc Wilson days ago, Morgan. You're too damn stubborn, and now we're losing her." The other hands stood back, tense, their faces shadowed. Silas didn't respond, his focus on the mare, but his jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid. Eliza stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Mr. Morgan's doing what he can, Cal. Ain't no vet getting here through that mud tonight." Cal turned, his eyes narrowing, but she held his gaze, her fear for her mother fueling her resolve. "Let him work. We'll sort it come morning." The barn fell silent, the mare's labored breathing the only sound. Cal muttered something under his breath and stormed out, the hands following slowly. Silas didn't look up, but his hands paused briefly, the cloth trembling slightly. Eliza knelt beside him, her skirt soaking in the damp straw. "Need another hand?" she asked softly. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and handed her a strip of cloth. They worked in silence, their hands brushing as they bound the mare's leg, the shared task of fragile thread binding them. As they finished, Silas stood, his face unreadable in the lantern light. He reached into his coat and pulled out the leather-bound book, placing it gently on a nearby crate. "Hers," he said, his voice barely audible. "My Sarah's. Recipes and other things." He didn't explain further, but the weight of the word Sarah hung between them, a name that carried years of unspoken grief. Eliza's breath hitched. The book wasn't just a ledger. It was a piece of Silas's past, a piece of Sarah. She wanted to ask, to understand, but the urgency of the letter surged back. Her mother, the mare, the ranch. It was all too much. She stood, her hands shaking, and met Silas's eyes. I might need to go, Mr. Morgan. My mother." Her voice broke, the words trailing into the barn shadows. Silas's gaze held hers, raw and searching, as if weighing her words against his own losses. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his hand tightening on the crate. "Wait till dawn," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. "Roads will be clearer." It wasn't a command, but a plea, and it left her frozen, torn between the ranch and the soddy, between duty and the fragile bond growing here. The mare whinnied softly, and outside, the rain intensified, a relentless drumbeat echoing the question. Could she leave now, when everything, Silas, the ranch, her own heart, was on the brink of breaking? The rain had softened to a drizzle by dawn, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Eliza stood in the Cookshack doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill, her eyes fixed on the muddy trail leading east toward her mother's soddy. Silas's words, "Wait till dawn," echoed her mind, a plea that had rooted her to the spot through the sleepless night. The leather-bound book, Sarah's book, lay on the table beside the crumpled letter, both heavy with unspoken promises and fears. The mare's pained whinnies from the barn had quieted, but the tension of the previous night lingered, a taut thread between her duty to her mother and the fragile belongings she'd found at the Broken Wheel Ranch. Eliza forced herself back to the stove, her hands moving automatically. The hands would need breakfast, storm or no storm, and the rhythm of cooking was her only anchor. She stirred Old Bessie, the sourdough starter, its tangy scent a faint comfort, and began mixing dough for biscuits. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the clean-swept floor. She sliced the last of the salt pork, its sizzle filling the shack with a familiar, grounding aroma. But her thoughts were elsewhere, on the soddy, her mother's fevered cough, the coins in her apron that might not be enough, and on Silas, whose quiet gestures, the tin, the roof repair, the book, had woven a bond she hadn't expected. As the biscuits baked, she glanced at Sarah's book. Curiosity, tempered by respect, had kept her from opening it, but its presence felt like an invitation, a piece of Silas offered in trust. She touched the wildflower embossed cover, her fingers lingering, then pulled back. It wasn't time. Not yet. The hands filed in, their faces weary from the storm's aftermath. Hank, his hat still damp, gave her a nod. "Mare's holding on, Miss Miller." Morgan stayed with her all night. Jed, the young hand, offered a shy smile, taking 2 biscuits. "These are keeping us going," he said, his voice soft. Eliza managed a faint smile, but her heart was heavy. The letter's words, "bad turn," "fever high," pressed against her, relentless as the rain had been. Silas didn't come to breakfast. His absence was a void, but Eliza felt his presence in the barn, tending the mare, carrying the weight of his own losses. She wrapped a few biscuits in a cloth, poured coffee into a tin mug, and stepped into the yard. The mud sucked at her boots, the air cool and sharp with the promise of a clearer day. The barn loomed ahead, its doors ajar, the smell of wet hay and leather drifting out. Inside, Silas knelt by the mare, his hand steady as he adjusted a makeshift splint. The animal's breathing was shallow, but steadier, her eyes less wild. Lantern light cast his face in stark relief, deepening the lines of exhaustion and grief. Eliza hesitated, then set the biscuits and coffee on a crate beside him. "For you," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look up, but his hands paused, a silent acknowledgement. She turned to leave, then stopped as his voice, low and rough, broke the quiet. "Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her name, and it stopped her cold. He stood slowly, his eyes meeting hers, raw and unguarded. "Your mother. You're going to her?" It wasn't a question, not really, but a recognition of the choice she faced. The leather-bound book lay on the crate, catching the light. He nudged it toward her, a deliberate, trembling gesture. "Take it. Might help." She stared at the book, her throat tight. "Mr. Morgan, I can't," she began, but he shook his head, cutting her off. "Sarah's recipes. Some remedies, too. Willow bark, herbs. Things she used when—" His voice faltered, the name Sarah carrying a weight that filled the barn. "Might help," he repeated, softer, his eyes fixed on the book as if it held the last of his courage. Eliza's fingers closed around the book, its leather warm from the lantern's glow. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the trust he'd placed in her. She clutched it to her chest, the letter's urgency warring with the warmth of this moment. "I'll be back," she said, more to herself than to him. "If I can." Silas nodded, his gaze dropping to the mare. "Roads are bad," he said. "Take my bay." She's steady. It was a practical offer, but it felt like more, a lifeline, a reason to return. He didn't look at her again, his hands returning to the mare, but the air between them hummed with something unspoken, fragile and strong. Eliza rode out at midday, the bay's hooves splashing through the mud, Sarah's book and the letter tucked in her satchel. The trail to town was a slog, the Wyoming landscape vast and unyielding, sagebrush glistening under the weak sun. Her heart pounded with every mile, fear for her mother battling the pull of the ranch behind her. She thought of Silas, alone in the barn, tending a mare that might not survive, carrying a grief that mirrored her own. In town, the soddy was a low, earthen mound, its door sagging on rusty hinges. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of sickness and lye soap. Her mother lay on a cot, her face pale, her breathing a ragged wheeze. The neighbor, Mrs. Tate, rose from a chair, her eyes kind but tired. "She's fighting, Eliza," she said. "Doctor's been twice. Left medicine, but it's costly." Eliza knelt beside her mother, her hand trembling as she smoothed damp hair from her forehead. She opened Sarah's book, finding a page with neat, faded handwriting. Willow bark tea for fever. She worked quickly, boiling water on the small stove, steeping the bark she'd brought from the ranch. The bitter aroma filled the soddy, a fragile hope. Her mother stirred, sipping the tea, her eyes fluttering open. "Eliza," she whispered, her voice a thread. "You're here." "I'm here, Mama," Eliza said, tears burning her eyes. She stayed through the night, tending her mother, reading Sarah's remedies, each page a lifeline from a woman she'd never know, but whose presence felt woven into her own. Days blurred into a rhythm of care. Eliza cooked simple meals, cleaned, and paid the doctor with her saved coins. Her mother's fever broke, her cough easing, but she was frail, her recovery uncertain. Eliza's thoughts kept drifting to the ranch, the Cookshack's warmth, the hands' murmurs, Silas's quiet gestures. She missed it more than she'd expected. A week later, a familiar creak of saddle leather announced a visitor. Eliza stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. Silas dismounted, his hat low, a cloth-wrapped bundle in his hand. "Heard you were here," he said, his voice rough but steady. He held out the bundle, a small loaf of sourdough bread, baked from old Bessie, its crust golden and fragrant. Thought it might help. Eliza's breath caught, the gesture echoing the tin, the book, the repaired roof. "Mr. Morgan," she began, but he shook his head, his eyes meeting hers, softer now, less guarded. "Silas," he corrected, a small, hesitant smile breaking through. The mayor pulled through. "Ranch ain't the same without you." He paused, his hand brushing the brim of his hat. "Your mother, she need you more?" Eliza looked back at the soddy, then at Silas, the bread warm in her hands. "She's better," she said softly, "but I can't leave her yet." She hesitated, then stepped closer, her voice steady. "There's a place in town, a small eatery. They need a cook. I could work there, be close to her. But the ranch," her voice trailed off, the unspoken question hanging between them. Silas's gaze held hers, the weight of his own losses mirrored in her eyes. "Ranch will wait," he said finally. "But if you're cooking in town, I'll bring wood. Keep the stove warm." It wasn't a promise of forever, but it was a beginning, a bridge across the miles. They stood in the quiet, the Wyoming wind soft now, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Eliza unwrapped the bread, breaking off a piece, offering it to him. They ate together, the sourdough tangy and familiar, a taste of the ranch, of Sarah, of home. The future was uncertain. Her mother's health, the eatery, the ranch. But in that moment, with Silas beside her, the bread shared between them, Eliza felt a warmth that outshone the morning sun. It was enough. For now, it was enough.